Greetings, brethren, and welcome to another production from upa7.org. Today we're going to look at this subject of the Standing Committee. Where's this found in the Shepherd's Rod? What is it? Actually, this is part of a discussion about the history of where God led his people after the death of Brother Houteff. So it's important to understand what the Standing Committee is, what it did. And so we're going to do a case study here today, and we're going to look at the following questions. Did a, quote, Standing Committee exist in the days of Old Mount Carmel under Brother Houteff? Why was a Standing Committee created in the first place? And by what authority was this standing, or as they called it, judicial committee, created? And then finally, are the actions of a standing committee legally binding upon Davidians for all time? This is really important to understand this, because this standing committee was created and it made decisions, and it indicates where God was leading, in the evolution of various Davidian factions. So this is important to understand. So we're going to look into this. We'll start with this text for meditation. I'll read this passage from Testimonies, Volume 4, page 594, paragraph 2. It reads, "Again and again was ancient Israel afflicted with rebellious murmurers. These were not always persons of feeble influence. In many cases, men of renown, rulers in Israel, turned against the providential leading of God and fiercely set to work to tear down that which they had once zealously built up. We have seen something of this repeated many times in our experience. It is unsafe for any church to lean upon some favorite minister, to trust in an arm of flesh. God's arm alone is able to uphold all who lean upon it." So we see this hint that history will repeat itself, that sometimes leaders in our midst, leaders of renown or rulers or people of influence, will often become the worst instruments of apostasy, that will tear down God's work. Ellen White experienced it in her day, and what does it make us think that we perhaps haven't experienced this in our lifetimes? That is, in the period after the death of Brother Houteff in 1955. And the answer is, we're going to look at this case and see how this exactly has been fulfilled. That people lean on the arm of flesh, a favorite minister, rather than leaning on God's arm. So, this is a deep subject. Please take a moment to pray and meditate about this, and to search yourself and to search the Word, the Golden Bowl, and decide for yourself whom God is leading today. So here's some background. You might have going, what is a standing committee? What am I talking about? Well, this is important. Here's some backdrop. Immediately following the death of Brother Houteff in 1955, his wife, Florence, usurped control of the association, destroyed the office of president, and had herself appointed as vice president. Now, this is all very well documented, and we've covered this in prior presentations on the rise of Florence Houteff and this history. So check in the description box below for links to some of this background. But this is what she did. She took over and rearranged the leadership organizational structure of the association by removing president, putting herself in as vice president. So this happened. Turns out that God granted Florence and her executive council about 7 years to manifest the fruits of their policies, which ended in a disgraceful abandonment of the message in March 1952. This, of course, was a document where Florence and her council renounced the message, calling Brother Houteff and Sister White false prophets, and they ran off into obscurity. So this was the tragic result of a number of blunders, which have been well documented, and we mentioned in the description box below, there's a video documenting this train of errors and tragedies at the hand of Florence Houteff and her unauthorized executive council. Well, God had people that, Davidians, that is, they identified themselves as 100% rod-only Davidians that were led by Harry Warden and M.J. Bingham. And they moved to rescue the movement, the original Shepherd's Rod, and that led to a pivotal reorganizational session that took place in Southern California in 1961. So this is the setup for where this standing committee comes in. Now, what happened is in the next year, 1962, there was a split between Warden and the Bingham factions. I guess you could call these were the two leaders, and two groups resulted. One that led to the Vista California Association and the other to Bingham's Bashan group. Now, most of us weren't there alive today, or many of us might have not even been born or were mere children. So how are we going to go back and decide if there's a split here? Then the question always comes, who's right and who's wrong? It has to be an answer. And so we have to go based on evidence. And by their fruit, you shall know them. So we've already covered this in prior history videos, but we want to look in particular on the topic of this standing committee and its actions, because this gives us a key and insight to understanding about what took place in this split in 1962. So leading up to the 61 reorganization, of course, there were two session codes, a pre-session code that was published calling for the reorganization, and then after that, a symbolic code that was published in 1961 that gave the minutes or the notes or the results of this meeting. Now, we've already talked again in another video about the authority to restart the code, because this unfortunately was not authorized. I mean, it led to the publication of something that was not under direct inspiration of a prophet. So even though these codes are very important, they have historical information and documentation of what Davidians did back in this time period, early 1960s, there are also things inside the second code here that would not be in harmony with the original rod. For example, the concept of the Bashan pasture, the Carmel had withered and now we're gone into Bashan, that was introduced by M.J. Bingham. We've got a whole video clarifying what that's all about. Check the link in the description box below. But that's just one example of the type of things that came about, and also the fact that they reorganized following the leadership model of Florence Houteff, i.e. they put in a vice president by popular vote of the people. So these are two examples of why these codes are not part of the Golden Bowl. They're important historical documents, but they're not inspired in the same level of the writings of the symbolic codes that were published by Victor Houteff. So here's the group of Davidians that were gathered in Southern California in that 61 session. And what were some of the results of that? Well, there was a new executive council established with Brother Warden voted in as vice president. So they're kind of following the example of Florence, thinking they have to have an executive council by popular vote of the delegates that were there, or whoever showed up. The session mandate that was recorded in their bylaws was really quite simple. It was essentially, one, publish the original Shepherd's Rod tract literature, because Florence had remodeled and completely remodeled the literature into this radio hour, 11th hour radio message. So it was essential to get the original literature back. And two, to train Bible workers. That was it. With this, we can agree that is the essential nature of the rod message, is to print literature and scatter it as leaves of autumn and train Bible workers to go out and minister in the name of the rod to reach our brethren in Laodicea. So that was important. there were some developments in this historic session that were not in harmony with the original Shepherd's Rod message. I alluded to that earlier. This idea that they followed the leadership model of Florence Houteff with no president and putting a vice president in the position of the president. That's one example. And the second was the idea that Carmel pasture had withered, the idea of the Bashan theology that came from the brain of M.J. Bingham. So not everything was 100% rod only, contrary to the claim. So let's focus in on this 62 split, because this is where the standing committee comes in. Now, we've done this timeline in prior videos showing the evolution of the message starting in 1930 up to the death of Brother Houteff, and then the period after his death up until Ezekiel 9 we call the scattering period. And we've done a video on that called The Scattering Time. Check the link in the description box below if you're not familiar with that. But the important part we want to focus here is, of course, Florence Houteff took over the association in 1955, and by 1962, her work ended. Prior to that, 1961, these 100% rod-only Davidians reorganized in Southern California to oppose Florence and her apostasy. The next year, 62, was the key year where a split manifested between two factions. One that was led by Brother Warden and formed the Vista California Association, and the other faction was led by Bingham and the Bashan pasture. And these resulted in two lineages, if you will, that are present in that lead down the line of events to our present day. So the question is, in this pivotal split, is who's right and who's wrong? We have to know. So we're going to look at this in more detail. And the history of the God's storehouse from Genesis to Revelation is a very important series, that 6-part video series that debuted in 2010 to show you definitive proof of where God's storehouse was moving during this period. And the key was who continued to publish the original rod tract literature. That's the key. So if you're not familiar with that, please visit our website, whiteparish.org, and under Storehouse History, and become acquainted with this. Now, as it turns out, that the counterfeits that have split off the rod aren't happy with this because it contradicts their narrative. So they're desperately trying to charge that our history, or the history that we've unveiled through documentation, is somehow false and that they're right. It's principally here the Bashan group that was started by Bingham. So this is where we're going to look in more carefully. And to understand this, you really need to understand Bingham's Timely Truth Educator. Okay, this is a document that is essential to Bashan's foundation. And let's look at some facts behind it. It was a publication that was started by M.J. Bingham, Volume 1, Number 1, in September of 1957. It was used, these Timely Truth Educators were used to introduce a number of heterodox doctrines contrary to the original Shepherd's Rod message. Heterodox means against or contrary to what was published by Brother Houteff in the Golden Bowl. Now, what are some examples of that? Well, the idea of the Porter president, separate from Elijah the prophet, that would lead the association. The idea of the living spirit of prophecy has to be a living Porter president to, quote, bind up the testimonies. That's one example. The other one, the Jacob Typology, this gross misinterpretation of the rod, claiming that Bashan was somehow Rachel, the righteous association, and all the others' wives were representative of various splinter associations that arose after the death of Brother Houteff. This is totally incorrect with history and theology, but it's another example of a major central pillar of the Bashan doctrines, What's another one? The Porter, Living Spirit Prophecy, Living Those With, the 42 months. We've exposed that in a video. All of those false doctrines come out of the brain of M.J. Bingham through the Timely Truth Educator. And to Bashan, these things are essential. They spend more time probably reading this stuff than they do the original Shepherd's Rod. The Timely Truth Educators also served as sort of what we call an undercover symbolic code to reorganize 100% rod only. That was a term that Bingham came up with. Davidians against the errors of Florence Houteff and Ben Roden. So if you look through these Timely Truth Educators, if you have time, they're very wordy and there's quite a bit of stuff to go through. But if you're interested, you could wade through it and you will see that Bingham specifically is exposing errors of Florence, which were gross and many, and also Ben Roden. So yes, he's standing up to oppose these errors, but what does he offer in its place? He introduces his own errors. So it's really not a remedy, but it was a fact of point that the Timely Truth Educator was used to reorganize against Florence and Ben Roden. Well, why is this of issue today? Well, M.J. Bingham is dead and gone. So who leads Bashan today? Well, became the next Porter president became the wife. This is the family hierarchy. We've documented this in a video. Please look the description box below. We have a link on leadership hierarchies amongst Davidian groups and the family hierarchy from father to wife dies, and it goes to the eldest son, Trevor. So Trevor is now the Porter president of Bashan, and he's desperately trying to justify their history by attacking the true history that we've documented, how God is led in the storehouse, published in the original, which they don't. So Trevor agitated this issue about the standing committee recently on Facebook, and he posted this image on an affidavit of the Standing Judicial Committee of Davidian Seventh-day Adventists, now published in 1962, page 21. Now, a lot of people are like, well, where's this document? What's this come from? Trevor never really tells you, so we're going to tell you. It comes from a document with the title, The Apostasy, Disqualification, and Removal of the Arlington Quorum, December 2nd, 1962. This is a massive document of 92 pages. And it's basically Bashan's justification for removing the executive council and putting themselves and claiming that they're God's true storehouse. So this standing committee was apparently the legal instrument used to, defend the truth, according to them. Well, if you look at it carefully, let's just read what happened here. Examine this. Okay, what you have is a legal document that was set before the state of California, county of Riverside. So they've gone to the courts, the law of the land, and it reads Donnie Adair. Now, people don't realize Don Adair was a close associate, a pupil, a disciple under MJ. He was literally his right-hand man. Being what first duly sworn disposes and says. So this is a legal deposition. 1, I am the duly elected chairman of the standing committee of the Davidian Seventh-day Adventist Association, which, between sessions, is the supreme judicial authority of the association. Whoa. Okay, so I guess Donnie is elected chairman of this, quote, standing committee. Is that how God appoints leaders? By popular vote? Well, this is how it happened here. And this standing committee is the supreme judicial authority over the association. It has the final say. What did they do? Well, what was the issue? Well, point 2 here, item 2. An appeal was properly, according to them, brought before the committee challenging the action of the Executive Council. That was the Executive Council that was put in place the year before, 1961. And they're challenging that they replacing challenged in their movement to replace certain officers of the association. Specifically, the Executive Council had replaced the treasurer, Mrs. Jemmy E. Bingham. That, by the way, is the adulterous second wife of M.J. Bingham. We have a video documenting that, if you're interested or don't know that. But she was a treasurer, okay? So she was replaced with Mrs. H.G. Warden. And the Executive Council replaced the editor of publications, Mr. M.J. Bingham, with Mr. W.H. Green, and had replaced a regular council member, Mr. W.J. Matthews, with a person other than the alternative council member, Mr. Arthur H. Harris. Okay, so the Executive Council removed 3 people and replaced them. Okay. Now, Trevor does not tell you what's going on behind the scenes, so that's why we're here. We're going to tell you what goes on behind the scenes. Furthermore, he does not disclose where this document comes from. This 92-page document, if needed, we can provide copies for it so that you can read it all for yourself. Trevor puts up this next document to justify the origination of this standing committee. And once again, he doesn't identify the source, so we'll do that for you. It's from a document called With Which Guide Will You Choose to Journey, published in 1963. Turns out that this is a 37-page document, of which this excerpt was taken. If you are interested, we can provide you a copy with this document as well. But we'll just read this excerpt. It said, "Thus, the delegates from all over the world, exercising the constitutional authority with which, as duly elected delegates, they were vested by Levitical law to enact new bylaws, formed a standing committee as the judicial authority or high court of appeal in the association. As such, its decisions are binding not only upon all members of the association, but also upon the Executive Council, individually and collectively. The essential purpose of the Standing Committee is for protecting both the churches and the ministry from unworthy members, TM page 26. Thus, in legislating into Levitical law, the delegates, with inspired farsightedness, were protecting the Davidian Seventh-day Adventist Association from future executive councils coveting and stealing Laban's idol of council dictatorship. And to effect this protective legislation, neither the bylaw alone nor the delegates alone were enough. It took 2 together. Illustration, page 11, center. So let's look at this illustration, because this is their argument for creating a standing committee, is to protect the association from renegade executive councils. So let's look on the next page. Trevor doesn't show this, but this is in the document. A schematic that was created by Donna Dare, and this is their justification for creating a standing committee. Basically what it is that they claim that in the bylaws of Leviticus, that the association at any session may enact, amend, or repeal bylaws by such representation and vote is exampled in Acts of Apostles, page 195. So that's assuming that the session is legally called for, but they can amend in bylaws, but to the Leviticus that was published by Brother Houteff. So then they have this session in 1961, the delegates from around the world, from all parts of the earth, that they will have authority, and then they legislate, and amend the bylaws, and create the standing committee to, quote, according to them, protect the church's ministry from unworthy members. Who decides who's worthy and who's unworthy? Well, that's an interesting question. But anyway, this committee is created, and then it has supreme authority. According to Acts of Apostle, God has vested his church with special authority and power, which no one can be justified in regarding, and despising, for he who does despises the voice of God. Be careful, brethren, by using an inspired statement out of its context. The General Conference uses the same reference. Are they the voice of God today? Come on, brethren, we all know better. That they are usurpers, that they use the General Conference to oppose. Back in 1901, Ellen White warned that they're no longer the voice of God. Why? Because they were ruled by a committee of men who are disconnected from God. So we cannot just automatically apply statements and say, well, that this standing committee was valid because they're claiming that they're the voice of God. That's a big assumption. And that this committee has power over the executive council, because the executive council is just a few people that they could control the work. Well, is that a problem? Oh, well, yeah, it was a problem in Ellen White's day. A small committee of men tried to control the publishing work and the health work in Battle Creek. And what happened? God burned it down and broke it up. And they had to reorganize in 1903 because the kingly authority exercised by the minds of a few men. Do you think it's possible that we could have a similar problem in our day? Most certainly. So let's look at this. Let's break it down and analyze it. Use our powers of reasoning and ask questions. What were the reasons for establishing a standing committee? Well, here's the facts. The main argument was to protect the association from being usurped by an influential figurehead. Such was the example of Florence Houteff and her executive council that commenced February 6, 1955, and ultimately ended in March 1962. So that's very well documented, how Florence Houteff, being the trusted wife of Victor Houteff and a very high IQ individual and very well respected, was able to usurp, control the association, destroy the leadership model, and put herself in as vice president. And she got people to follow her. And her track record, the fruits of their council over that 7-year period are without doubt a great reproach to the message. They took the message literally into the ditch. They were certainly not under the control of God. And Satan used them in an effort to destroy the message. So that was the main reason they set up a standing committee. So they're going to reorganize in 1961. And then the members of this standing committee were to be comprised of Davidians from all around the world field. And then the standing committee was invested with authority to overrule the actions of the executive council as deemed by members of the standing committee. So because Florence Houteff's council got renegade and went out of control, they didn't want to have another problem of a handful of people running the message off into the ditch. So the standing committee was going to presumably protect against this. So that sounds good, right? It sounds like, hey, that's the right thing to do. However, we can look back and analyze this and ask some questions about the standing committee. For example, did Brother Houteff have a standing committee to rule over the lawful executive council that existed at Old Mount Carmel in his time, that was created in 1943 with the publication of Leviticus and ended at his death in February 5, 1955? Well, the answer to this one is no. It's nowhere in the rod. So this standing committee was the invention or creation of somebody or some people after the death of Brother Houteff. That's a fact. Next, are there any inspired instructions in the Leviticus for Davidian Seventh-day Adventists to establish a standing committee after his death to oversee an unauthorized or renegade executive council patterned after the Florence Houteff or M.J. Bingham? Well, if there is, then show it to us. The Leviticus is the organizational manual for Davidians. Do we find a standing committee in there? Or any instruction that that's what we're going to do to oversee an executive council? Brethren, it's not there. Okay. Furthermore, how were the members of this standing committee to be selected or appointed? It said delegates from around the world field, but how do you know those delegates were right or not? How do you vet them out, if you will? What did they believe? Were they voted in by popularity? Was it political in nature? We know the trouble of that. That's like the example of Saul. People wanted a king over them, okay? So that's another question. Who were these members and how did they get appointed? And then next, what is to prevent a standing committee, if you will, from being coerced and manipulated by one or two persuasive members with strong motives to preserve their positions of influence? I mean, it's certainly possible that just as the executive council could be manipulated and influenced, the standing committee could as well. They were not infinite in size. So is it possible? The answer certainly is. So let's look at the evidence. So what were the issues that led up to this 62 split? Okay, well, in the 61 session, placed M.J. Bingham as the editor of the publishing work. And this led to problems. What were the problems? Well, we have documents that show that the problems were that Bingham, there was this thing about Bingham, even Trevor says this, and people that knew Bingham. Bingham, it was said that it's either my way or the highway. He was a strong dictatorial force. Anybody that knew him will testify to this. So this is not my words. Trevor told it to me himself. And so as editor of the publishing work, what he wanted was total control over what was going to be published. He obviously took it upon himself because he was already published in the Timely Truth Educators, and he thought of himself as perhaps the anointed one. He was smarter than everybody else. He was a wordsmith. He was very able to use words. He was Brother Houteff's right-hand man, his editorial assistant. And as some Davidians say, he had a way with words. And if you've ever read any of his publications, you'll certainly discover that. So there were some Davidians that had a problem with this one man having total control over what was published with no oversight. So that was really the root of the problem. And there was friction, and this is documented in letters and documents. Turns out the Executive Council under Warden removed two members. It actually should be three, but the two principal ones were the treasurer and the editor of the publications. That is M.J. Bingham and his wife. For what? Basic collusion and promoting heresy. Of course, the wife was supporting him, Bingham, and so that was collusion. And then the heresies were things that he was publishing. I think some people detected there were some problems. And Bingham was not going to allow anybody to doubt or question or proofread or edit or correct what he decided was going to go. So that was really the root of the issue. So the Executive Council acted. Then the standing committee that was chaired by Donna Dare persuaded its members to overthrow Warden in the Executive Council and establish a new Executive Council under Bingham. So it turns out Donna Dare was the go-man for Bingham. And these members of the committee, like we say, who appointed them? Well, where did they come from? If they came from parts of the vineyard, were they familiar with all the issues? Was it possible that they could be persuaded to go a certain way? It certainly is. So it turned out that Warden in a quorum refused to concede the assets of the association, that should be association, and this caused Bingham and Adair to take the matters into their own hands. Now this is what Trevor's not going to tell you, is that Warden and the Executive Council, they had a office. It was at a private home. that somebody owned. It turns out it belonged to Warden. And that office had the equipment. They had printing plates, and they had typewriters and mimeograph machines and the various things, the mailing list and so forth, and the assets that belong to the association that allow them to, publish literature and send out newsletters and so forth. Well, in a legal dispute, if there's a contest between two parties, then it would really have to go to a court of law, and then a judge would decide who's the rightful owners of this stuff, of the assets. And if that's the case, then the judge would determine that, the assets have to be seized and then turned over to the party that won the lawsuit or the case. However, Bingham and Dare bypassed this, and they decided to take the matter in their own hands. And what am I talking about? Well, this is documented here in this letter. It's a 4-page document. It's not terribly long, but I'll read it. It came from the association address 5667 Stover Avenue, Arlington, California. That was where the council was, the association had their offices. And it says, Dear Davidians, Davidian office raided by the Standing Committee Chairman and M.J. Bingham. And I'll read these 2 paragraphs. Shortly before sundown, Friday, November 30th, Brother and Sister Haylock were hurrying home from the store when, to their surprise, they saw Bingham's station wagon backed up to the association office. Then they were even more surprised to see Brother Bingham come out of the office loaded with association belongings. Their surprise was not so great then to see the Standing Committee Chairman, that's Donna Dare, grabbing up a load and following him. These brethren hurried into the station wagon and drove off. That is, Bingham and Adair jumped off and drove off. They were caught in the act. Brother Haylock immediately notified the sheriff's office of the raid and called the other council members. So I guess that's what you do when somebody breaks and enters into your place of residence. You call the law. Next paragraph. Upon investigation, it was found that they, the Standing Committee Chairman, and M.J. Bingham had gained entrance to the building by forcing the restroom window in the back of the building, and that one of them, in all probability Brother Adair, had crawled through the window and opened the front door. Further investigation revealed the fact that besides taking expensive equipment, such as electric typewriters, the mimeograph machine, a dressing machine, and the adding machine, they had also taken all of the association's records and numerous other articles, leaving the heavy desk and articles of lesser value. The council members fastened the window more securely, locked the office doors, and returned to their homes. And then it goes on. It turns out that Adair and Bingham weren't over. That night they came back and they document the night raid. They broke in again. Now, just stop here. This is what happened. What happens when you go to a private residence and break in through the window, go in and open the door, and then start hauling the contents of the place out? That's a violation of law. It's called breaking and entering. And stealing is called robbery. These are crimes. These could be, I suppose if they wanted, you could go and file a case and go to court, and they could be tried for this. Apparently the brethren did not do this, but breaking and entering is a criminal activity. I'm sure that the sheriff's office got a report to that, and then the sheriff probably asked them, do you want to file charges? Because that would be the logical next step when somebody steals your stuff, breaks into your home and steals your stuff. Now, they mentioned that Adair probably snuck through the window. I heard reports that the window was small, and Adair was young and agile, and he was able to squeeze through this window in this criminal act. This is an act, a crime. Now, why can you say this? We weren't there, but we can certainly judge by the evidence. If the Standing Committee and Bingham and Adair thought they were right, then the legal method when you have a contest between two groups, disputed property, is to go to the court, the judge renders a ruling, or if necessary, they go to a trial by court, and the jury decides which party's right, which is wrong, based on evidence. Okay, that's what we have to do. We have to go based on evidence. But they look at the evidence, they make a decision, the judge rules, okay, it belongs to this party, Party A. And Party B has the goods. So Party A cannot go in and break and enter to take the goods. That would be breaking more law. It would just be illegal. So how does it happen in the legal system? In the case where the judge renders in favor of one party, the sheriff, then the judge orders a decree, and the sheriff goes with a warrant and seizes the assets of the property, not the other party. That would create friction and a showdown. So the sheriff shows up with a warrant written by a judge, commanders the assets, and takes them to the neutral property, neutral territory, whatever, the courthouse or the sheriff's office. And then they call the other party and say, we've got your goods, come and take them. Come and get them, and then they sign off. That's the legal way to deal over disputed goods. But Adair and Bingham bypassed this and broke law and took it in their own hands. So this is what we're showing here. Is this what God's people would have God's people do? So we come back once again to this Fox arguments, 92 pages of justification written by Don Adair to justify their illegal activities, making it appear as if it had some legal authority. So Trevor's pulling the wool over the woods, just showing you a little piece of evidence, but not telling the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey would say. Sad situation. So what can we conclude from these investigations? Well, the standing committee was concocted in the brain of M.J. Bingham, and it has no authority in the writings of the original Shepherd's Rod message. Bingham concocted it as an effort, to save from a renegade council such as Florence Houteff, and I guess it would sound good, but he used it as a weapon for his own agenda. So even though the standing committee seemed like a reasonable mechanism to avoid a tyrannical and wayward executive council, it proved to be just another man-made policy that produced its own baleful results. It too became tyrannical and wayward, just like Florence Houteff's executive council. So the efforts of Bingham and Adair to influence a standing committee as a weapon to punish their enemies was clearly manifest. The fact that they had to go to the law of the land to force their case and ended up committing crimes, breaking and entering and stealing, made manifest that God was not with them. If they really believed that God was with them, they would have walked away and asked for God to bless them, and they would have started over from scratch. But no, they had to commit crimes because they themselves were incapable of trusting God to provide for them to get their own equipment rather than steal. So what's the remedy today for all these political follies is to understand the scattering time and how today, as Elijah's helpers in the hands of Zerubbabel, will finish the work of the original Shepherd's Rod this side of the kingdom. And we publish videos on this. That we have no authority to set up man-made councils or standing committees because the results of them have nothing but folly and madness and politics. Man-appointed, man-authorized political power struggles, and the results are nothing but divisions and factions and fighting over turf, property, and so forth. But if we go forward by the authority of the rod and set up publishing work in locations around the world and organize groups of people in their local facility or local area and train up Bible workers through various means, then we can advance the rod exactly how God told us to in this period where we don't have a prophet or we don't have a president or a man-appointed vice president or a porter or King David or anything else. It's a remedy to all these unauthorized usurpers in this man-made folly. Go follow the instructions in the rod. We don't need office seekers. It's that simple. If you're looking for a position, then you're not with God. You're a usurper. We can go forth as Elijah's helpers, claiming no credit for ourselves, but simply doing what Brother Houteff already laid out in the rod. The message, the literature is ready and waiting. So publish it, brethren, and scatter it as the leaves of autumn to reach Laodicea. Then the kingdom will come. So this concludes our presentation. We appreciate your time. If you have any further questions or comments on this subject, then please subscribe to this YouTube channel, Universal Publishing Association, or our alternative on Bright Eon that won't censor people, for future updates on this and related topics. And to request either copies of the original Shepherd's Rod Tract literature or any of the documents mentioned in this video, then please, let us know. Or most importantly, assistance. If you need help to establish your own publishing house in your area, then feel free to contact us anytime. Here's our email, upa5453@gmail.com, or our phone number. You can text message or connect us with us through WhatsApp, and we'll certainly help you do this. And bypass all this political theater of standing committees, executive councils, unauthorized porters, presidents, and so forth. And go forward trusting King Jesus and God alone to lead you every step of the way, all the way to the kingdom. And here's one of our websites. We've got 3, yparish.org, that addresses these issues or controversies amongst various Davidian groups since the death of Brother Houteff. So we thank you for your time. May God richly bless your search for truth as for hidden treasure, and to cease ye from man, whose breath is in his nostrils. Godspeed.